Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch, and welcome to our online participants watching from all around the world. My name is Marga Gual. I'm the head of science diplomacy capacity building here at GESDA, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the session on governing the global commons, a frontier for collective action. From the high seas to outer space, the global commons are fast becoming the battlegrounds of the 21st century, not just for exploration, but for power, for profit, and for survival. We are witnessing the securitization, the militarization, the commercialization, even the weaponization of the global commons, such as the oceans, the polar regions, outer space, even cyberspace. In this session, we're going to explore how do we balance sovereignty and security with openness and access to shared spaces for scientific research, global collaboration, and all of that for the benefit of humanity. The GESDA Science Breakthrough Radar, as you have already discovered, launched yesterday, highlights these issues as frontier challenges for anticipatory governance. Advances in areas such as orbital management, space mining, deep sea exploration, or cybersecurity point to the need of new ways of collective stewardship, new models that can balance innovation with equitable access and long-term sustainability. So today we're going to discuss how can we keep the global commons global and common for humanity today and for the generations to come. And for this, we have a stellar panel with Aarti, Holla-Maini, Director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, Sabine Gollner, Senior Scientist at the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research, Doaa Abdel Motaal, Visiting Professor in Polar Studies at Sciences Po, and Francesca Bosco, the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberPeace Institute. So let's get started, and we're going to take a deep dive to the deep sea with Sabine. We'll start with you. In September 25 this year, very recently, the High Seas Treaty, BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions, reached a threshold of 60 ratifications, meaning it can enter into force. It's the first legally binding instrument for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity. So tell us a bit more about how the ocean is governed. What does it mean that the ocean is a global common? And what are the opportunities and challenges you see in this evolution of the governance, the use, and the access of deep sea?
Yeah, thanks a lot, first of all, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and also to talk about the ocean, about the deep sea. Probably start with it that 40% of our entire planet are actually global commons, are ocean. It's related to the fact that 70% of our planet are ocean, and all the areas that are beyond 200 nautical miles of a country, that's about 370 kilometers, belong to no one and everyone are global commons. So 40%, remember this number, is global commons on our entire planet. And not only that, it's not only a very large area, but it's also a huge volume. When we think about the ocean, you have to remember that the average depth is 3,800 meters. So it's a very deep ocean, a dark ocean with a lot of function and services it provides. And no matter if we talk about climate change, about biodiversity crisis, although we probably might feel disconnected from the ocean, we depend on it. 90% of our excess heat is taken up by the ocean. 25% of our carbon is taken up by the ocean. And also 50% of our oxygen is made by the ocean. So even if you never swim in the ocean, if you have never been diving, you depend on the ocean. And I think that's why it's so important to also embrace the ocean as a global common here. And all these functions and services that the ocean provides for free to us, made by organisms, by biodiversity. And just to give a bit of numbers of what we know about the ocean, our global commons, at the moment, 200,000 species are described from our ocean, only 20,000 from the deep sea, although it is the largest biome on Earth. We think that there are 500,000 up to 10 million species that do all kinds of functions and services, which means that we only scratch or see the tip of the iceberg. About 90% of all life in the ocean we do not know yet. And here it's important to know that the ocean, I think it's very difficult if you've never, to imagine how it looks like. If I ask my first year students, the ocean, the deep sea, what is the first picture you get? An anglerfish, little lantern. It's, I think, what many people have in mind. But here, I think it's important to consider that the deep sea has a lot of different landscapes or better seascapes, just like on land. So, for example, I grew up in Austria. We have a lot of mountains there with distinct animals, plants. Now I live in the Netherlands, a very flat country, different vegetation, different animals. And it's very similar in the deep sea. We also have mountain chains, and we also have very flat areas. And for example, these flat areas are abyssal plains, and they not only host marine biodiversity, but they host, for example, also minerals, metals. So, and the more also we explore the deep sea, the more also we want probably to exploit it in the future. And I think here it's very important to wisely think what we should do and what we should not do. Also, the ocean works on different timescales. It's important with regards to global commons to think about our future generations. Just to give one example, I think all of you probably have heard about potential deep seabed mining of these polymetallic nodules on abyssal plains. These nodules grow at a speed or slowness of a few millimeters per million years. So every nodule is millions of years old. We know that there is life that is dependent on the nodule. They can only live on the nodule, nowhere else. And we also do not yet fully understand the function of these polymetallic nodules, such as, for example, oxygen production. It was measured, but we have no clue how significant this is. But we do know, basically, if we take them away, it's gone forever. So we do not know what we lose, but we lose it forever. And of course, here you have to consider different scales, of course, of impact. But this, I think, just mirrors the importance of the global commons, of including also in the ocean the effect of time. And as already mentioned with the BBNJ, I think it's great that actually it will come into force in January, and it provides a lot of opportunities to make sure that the biodiversity is protected and used potentially in a sustainable manner.
Thank you very much, Sabine. From deep sea, we're going to travel to outer space. So outer space experiences rapid commercialization through satellite mega constellations, plans for space research extraction, raising questions about sustainability, security, and equitable access. Countries are setting up their own space stations, and the future of the international space stations is now into question. How do we continue a global collaboration to enable space for all with new actors coming into play? You at the UNOOSA have already advanced some of these anticipatory frameworks, such as a new global space law project. So, Aarti, tell us more about the state of space and how we keep it as a global common.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I'm very grateful to you and also my colleagues at the Government of Switzerland for involving me in this event. You know, this is the first time that I've had to step out of a purely space domain and speak with other colleagues who represent other global commons. And it provoked a whole the thought process on my side. And I think I'd like to start by highlighting an important difference when we talk about global commons. When the UN, for example, the Secretary General, speaks about space as being one of the 4 or 5 global commons, he is really invoking the ethical principles of like an ethical framing of stewardship and shared responsibility. Yeah, and that's correct, that's appropriate. But at UNOOSA, we are not at that high level. Well, we're space, we're at the highest level, but we're not at that, we're not looking down at all of those different areas. We're very much within the space milieu, and here we are very careful not to speak about space as a global commons, because it is automatically understood as having very specific legal implications of ownerships and shared benefit and things like this, which is not around which there is no consensus. So we refer to space as the province of all humankind, and this is indeed embodied in the Outer Space Treaty from 1967. Very easy to see the difference. So Outer Space Treaty in 1967 spoke about province of humankind. It was accepted, it was ratified. The Moon Treaty, some 12 years later, talked about the common heritage of mankind and was rejected, and hardly any of the spacefaring nations have actually signed it or ratified it. So you can see with that example how important this nuance is, and I did want to set that there. What is further interesting is that despite that fact, the principle of space being the province of all humankind was actually established way before the Global Commons for the Sea was established and accepted, right? And I think that's interesting, but it's also fairly simple to understand. Way back when, space was new, it was a frontier, it was inspiring, it was unifying. It's easy to say, well, nobody owns that, we all own that. When there's no vested interest, there's no competing commercial interests, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the high seas and the oceans, of course, we had global trade, we had resources extraction, multiple competing interests already going on, which explains why it was so much harder to reach consensus on. Outer Space Treaty was agreed very, very quickly. You only had two superpowers really driving that, because they didn't want to see space as a new arena for conflict, compared with UNCLOS, etc., which took, I think, some decades to get sealed. So I wanted to start the remarks by just putting that in context, because I think these are some interesting similarities and parallels that are worth discussing. Now, historically, space, yes, it was inspiring, etc., but it had more strategic value rather than commercial value. But now, of course, space is a massive economy. It has huge potential going forward. And so I think governance is now becoming a little harder, but thankfully, at least in Vienna, I know it's a different story in Geneva, but in Vienna, it's progressing well. Here, in this session, we're meant to be talking about how science and diplomacy can anticipate and shape the governance going forward, also to make sure that space can remain available for everybody. And when it comes to space, diplomacy was really at the foundation of space governance. And that's cool. I think that's really cool. You know, in 1959 already, member states came together and they established COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and they agreed very reasonably quickly on the Outer Space Treaty. That committee is the largest committee which has been established by the GA. And it was a remarkable act of foresight, if we think back now, because governments already then anticipated that, okay, we want to make sure that conflict doesn't happen, therefore we want to make sure that we commit now to a platform where all member states, be they spacefaring or not, be they large or small, sit on an equal footing, and where decisions are taken not by voting but by consensus. And this was established, this method of work was established way back when. So I think it's a tremendous act of foresight that we've seen there, and a commitment to international cooperation, the fruits of which have been plentiful and continue to be. So not only do we have the Outer Space Treaty, we had the following 4 treaties that followed, and you know, the core treaties really provide the framework for the flourishing space economy that we are all observing today. And these treaties were designed to foster transparency and build trust and so on. Now they are coming to life and being operationalized in a way that I think nobody could have imagined, even though there was so much foresight involved. So imagine that the treaty on the agreement, the agreement on the rescue and return of astronauts foresaw what should rights and obligations be in case debris falls back down to Earth and causes damage here on Earth. And that was written in, I don't even remember the year, 68? I'm looking at Natalia, I'm sure you know. A long time ago, let's say, at least 50 years ago. Yeah. So the same collaborative spirit that went into those treaties underpins the method of work of COPUOS, as I said, and it has worked. We have 6 decades of space governance. It started with the binding treaties. It's evolved towards guidelines, principles, and resolutions, and now those that governance, I'm being attacked by a fly, is even addressing areas where questions of ownership are coming up, right? So I'm thinking about mining asteroids, activities on the moon by commercial companies, extracting resources and so on. But thankfully, we have a forum which presents the best conditions for fostering trust, as I said, consensus building and so on. Looking forward, when we think of science now, for me, science means subject matter expertise. So you have the diplomacy, which is very much there, still working, still delivering. We've recently seen an expert group be established on space situational awareness. We have an action team which is discussing sustainable lunar activities, including lunar traffic coordination will be part of that. I mean, so it's continuing to proceed despite everything that's going on in the world. But of course, we cannot establish governance on areas which are so new, so many more such areas emerging, and they are necessarily complex and technical. That cannot happen in a vacuum. When I look at delegates who come to Vienna, I'm always taken aback because they have to cover drugs and crime, industrial development, nuclear, and space, and they're diplomats. They're diplomats. That's a tall ask. When we think about debris removal, space traffic coordination, I mean, mining, all kinds of activities that are happening, how do we expect these delegates to competently and confidently deliberate and take decisions here? We must do capacity building and support the member states. And that's where the science and the subject matter expertise really is important. That's why since I've come to the UN, which is just 2 years ago from industry, we've seen, for better or for worse, we've seen a lot more industry coming and engaging with the member states, and I believe that's valuable and important because that's where the operational expertise and the experiences really reside. I'll close. Of course, that there's a small dynamics change with that. It's new for member states. COPUOS has operated in one way for a very long time, but I'm quite unapologetic about that. What I am committed to with member states is that the decision-making forum must purely remain with the member states. Would never want to see industry around the table taking those decisions. I think that the conditions and the method of work of COPUOS is so valuable that it must be preserved at all costs. So it's on me and my office to maintain the trust and the open communication with the member states to ensure them that what we do when we bring industry for side events, etc., is purely to inform and raise the knowledge of awareness in order to elevate the quality and competency of the discussions that are happening in the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aarti. That was incredibly clear. Thanks for that clarity and I think also that determination in terms of how do you see that future governance. I think it takes us very nicely into a segue now to Antarctica. You mentioned the year 1959, and that is the year the Antarctic Treaty was signed. And I would like to segue by picking up on something Aarti said for Doaa in terms of the foresight and the anticipation that the signatories at the time, when taking that step, what they were seeing into the future. The Antarctic Treaty preserved a continent for science, for peaceful exploration, for humanity. But in 2048, it might be up for discussion. So how do you see the evolution of Antarctica? What drove those countries to preserve it as a global common? But how is it evolving, and what do you see the opportunities and also the challenges or threats that it might have? And what does it mean for our planet and our climate?
Okay, thank you very much for this, and it's a pleasure to be here. Of course, to answer all these questions, I would need, I don't know, maybe a month or two. But to just give you a flavor of the issues in the Antarctic that relate to the themes of this particular session and the conference. I think point number one is that whereas probably in public imagination, Antarctica is a global common, in legal terms, that's an uncertain and debatable issue. The Antarctic is governed, the Antarctic, first of all, is a continent that's double the size of Australia, and it's governed by the Antarctic Treaty System. The Antarctic Treaty has 58 signatories, so half of which are decision-making parties and half of which are non-decision-making parties. And when the UN Secretary General issued a report in 2022, just recently, a report called Our Common Agenda, I think it was called, where he included Antarctica in the basket of global commons, about 8 members of the Antarctic Treaty System sent a letter to the UN objecting and indicating and informing the UN Secretary General that Antarctica, in their view, is not a global common. And those 8 parties included the United States, Argentina, and other players in the Antarctic Treaty System. So point number one is that we don't know whether Antarctica is a global common. To the minds of parties to the Antarctic Treaty, it is not a global common. It is governed by the Antarctic Treaty System, which is not part of the United Nations system. Now, the Antarctic Treaty, what is it about and how did it come about and what is the role of science in that treaty? Obviously, GESDA is about science and anticipatory science, and so Antarctica has a very special role to play on this issue of science. Basically, between 1904 and 1940, when there was no specific governance regime for Antarctica, countries started making territorial claims in Antarctica. Seven of them were made, with countries basically enshrining in national legislation that parts of Antarctica belong to them. So, for example, Australia believes that about 42% of the continent is Australian Antarctic territory. There is domestic legislation to that effect, and so on. And those 7 countries are Chile, Argentina, the United Kingdom, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, and France. So 7 countries made territorial claims. The 2 superpowers at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union, refrained from making a territorial claim because they knew that that could lead to a war. So instead, an Antarctic treaty system was born that demilitarized the continent. It was an accord initially between 12 countries that were active in Antarctica, so the 7 claimants plus a few more. The Antarctic Treaty was negotiated to put a stop to the claims race, to say those territorial claims are not off the table, but we don't recognize them. They're frozen in some ways. And the treaty demilitarized the continent. In fact, it was one of the first demilitarization agreements that we've had. And it dedicated the continent to peace and scientific research. So science is absolutely central to the Antarctic Treaty. Since then, the treaty has expanded. And it expanded because when the United Nations was born and many countries around the globe gained their independence, countries started to ask, who does Antarctica belong to, and what is this Antarctic Treaty, and have a few monopolized the last remaining continent. And the question of Antarctica was placed on the agenda of the United Nations for many years, with developing countries asking why a certain number of rich players had monopolized Antarctica. And so on. And as a response to that, the Antarctic Treaty System grew. The entry ticket when the Antarctic Treaty System was born to becoming a party to the treaty was that you had to have the technological capability to send a scientific expedition to Antarctica and to establish a scientific research station. A second category of membership was created, if you will, to diffuse the tension that was emerging at the United Nations, where you could become a non-consultative party, an observer in the language of Geneva, if you will, where you can come, you can listen, you can contribute papers, but you don't vote. You don't have a say, you're not a decision maker. And so that second category of membership, which is now about half of the total parties of the Antarctic Treaty, diffused tension, and eventually in the United Nations, the question of Antarctica was taken off the table. But really, I would say that the Antarctic Treaty System was born to prevent war from coming to Antarctica, to put an end to the claims race, to stop countries from testing weapons in Antarctica, and to dedicate the continent to science. There are now 58 parties to the treaty. Some of them had thought about mining the continent. That was stopped because the rest of the world would not have it, that a small group of countries would start extracting minerals from Antarctica. And in fact, there is now a ban on mining in Antarctica and an environmental protocol that applies to the continent. So this is roughly how the Antarctic continent is governed today. Science, if you will, is what allows peace to prevail in Antarctica, but science is also a tool for political goals in Antarctica. Since the creation of the Antarctic Treaty, scientific research stations have flooded the continent. Initially, they were around the edges of the continent, then they've moved inwards. We now have a continent that is absolutely covered in scientific research stations. The Antarctic Peninsula, which is the most accessible part of Antarctica, is fully covered in stations. And questions are asked as to whether there is really that much science going on in Antarctica that would warrant the presence of all these stations, whether there's duplication in that science, or whether some stations are at all doing any science. So science is also a tool in Antarctica simply for planting the national flag. And for conducting administrative operations that would, in the event of a settlement of the question of Antarctica, allow a country to say, I am there, I have been conducting activities. The International Court of Justice has a number of criteria for how to claim land in a new frontier. One of them is discovery, occupation, performance of administrative acts, and there are a number of criteria. And discovery is something that all parties to the Antarctic Treaty System are documenting very well. Any country that has discovered any part of Antarctica or anything in Antarctica is quick to document what it's done for discovery. Occupation, a scientific research station, is in a sense occupation. Administrative acts, those stations perform administrative acts every day. They take calls, they send letters, they bring food, they refuel, they do this, they do that. Lots of administrative acts, and so on. So science in Antarctica is many things, and it goes beyond mere scientific research, even though important scientific research does take place in Antarctica. Looking forward, the environmental protocol to the Antarctic Treaty System can be revisited if a country asks for it to be re-looked at, if you will, or reopened, and that includes the ban on mining. That can happen in 2048. This is the date that our moderator was referring to. So if a country does raise its flag in 2048 saying it wants to amend the environmental protocol, the ban on mining could potentially be reopened. However, I think looking ahead, what we need to consider is whether the Antarctic Treaty System can hold in the face of many different challenges. Antarctica has minerals. Antarctica has a very strategic location. Will it remain dedicated to science, and will it remain peaceful, and will the Antarctic Treaty System succeed in putting the lid, if you will, on the scramble for resources that we're seeing in other parts of the globe? That's an open question, and we can go into that in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We will go more into that, but I'm watching everyone very eager to ask questions, so we'll get to you. Let us go to our last domain, cyberspace, and I think the first question, is cyberspace a global common? And how do you relate to the deep sea with the cables that go to the satellites? How do you relate to everything that we have discussed so far, Francesca?
I know that as a matter of courtesy, I should say thank you so much for inviting me, but I won't because, thank you so much for inviting me to such a stellar panel, but I feel like the black or the white sheep in this case, meaning that I wish I could, let's say, elaborate so eloquently, for example, when it comes to the governance piece regarding, let's say, a sort of like commonly agreed approach and so on and so forth, but we are far from that. But, I try to be optimist, and I see this as an opportunity. So thank you so much for your question. And as I was sharing with Marga, I spent all my life in cybersecurity, working many, many years at the UN, World Economic Forum, and in the international environment. And I was, deeply thankful about the framing around the global commons. Interestingly, the last thing that I did before leaving the forum 5 years ago, and now I work for an international nonprofit organization that is called the CyberPeace Institute. I wrote an article actually with an Oxford professor arguing about how cybersecurity should be treated as a global public good. So it's my personal, let's say, advocacy battle, so I'm very happy to be here with you. Trying to answer to your question and maybe sharing some food for thoughts, and again, we can elaborate better in the Q&A. As I would say, how it fits, let's say, in a way, cyberspace, the definition of global commons, and now it has some specific features in a way. I would say that if we think about the let's say, and allow me to simplify here, but the main characteristics of the global common in terms of like shared space beyond national borders, governed by the common heritage of humankind, provide essential services, and that in a way require collective stewardship. And we see this especially in this moment, to prevent overuse and conflict. We see how, in a way, it aligns. And also with my specific, let's say, with my bias hat coming from cybersecurity, I would say that what connects us, like cyberspace, also endanger us if left basically unmanaged. And cyberspace fits this definition because it's, let's say, borderless and interconnected, that transcend geography, like other commons. It's vital, as we know, for humanity's that functioning and for the functioning of our societies. It's built on open, interoperable protocols, and so if you think about it, and okay, now it's a little bit challenged, let's put it in this way, but if you think about it, it's a universal access by design. And at the same time is in a way, let's say, facing the tragedy of the commons, and allow me to use this term, because we see, unfortunately, cybercrime flourishing, misinformation, weaponization, especially, within the context of the geopolitical rivalry. And what I think is particularly interesting compared to the others in a way is that it's a sort of like newest frontier of the global common because it's built by humans. So it's not natural, let's say, but now it's essential, I would say, to all humanity. And again, I continue my advocacy piece in terms of like, just as we protect the ocean or outer space, we must also govern the digital environment collectively. And allow me here to go into, sharing a couple of like, consideration. One, and this is also why I joined, let's say, the CyberPeace Institute, is to conceive cyberspace and let's say, protecting cyberspace, not only as a digital and technical domain, but a profoundly human one. And one of the reasons why I always say I jump on the other side of the fence is because I truly believe that every cyber attack has a human victim, and the cost of insecurity online is paid offline and often by the most vulnerable. And this is why I think we have to reframe cyberspace not only as a global common, but also as a human common, not just a digital one, first step. Then the second step is indeed the governance challenges. That's what I was mentioning at the very beginning. Let's face it, the cyberspace is, as I mentioned before, man-made, and much of it privately or nationally owned. So we are facing, let's say, an infrastructure challenge. In a way, digital sovereignty and fragmentation, which are, let's say, particularly relevant in this moment, are threatening, in a way, its universality. And the current governance, and hence my comment on the treaties, is a sort of like patchwork, I would say. I don't have any other word for this, of norms, and there's no treaty-based regime. For good, for bad, I mean, if we think about the protection of the commons, I think it's not necessarily a sweet spot to be in. And I think, on the other hand, and this is why I remain optimist, let's say, is a moment for, in a way, for governance innovation. Hence, here it comes also the aspect of anticipatory science and diplomacy where it fits, I would say, because anticipatory diplomacy means also recognizing that cyberspace as a human commons, but also how we can preserve, basically, this specificity. And I think it's not so much, and I like the framing of the panel, but I think it's not so much whether cyberspace can be a global common, but also it's whether where we can govern it as one before fragmentation, unfortunately, as we are seeing in this moment, is taking over. And I very much like when Aarti was mentioning at the very beginning the aspects also of responsibility, because I think we must treat cyberspace not as a property to control, which is what we've seen happening lately also with some of the current almost adopted treaty that are going to be signed soon, like the cybercrime treaty, but more as a sort of like shared responsibility to protect, which means also, let's say, again, not considering cyberspace just with, let's say, the technical dimension, but it means also to consider equitable access. It means ensuring, let's say, diversity of voices, and that digital rights, but also human digital rights, let's say, are preserved. I stop here, but happy to elaborate further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And thanks for mentioning the tragedy of the commons, which I think we haven't mentioned, but all of the examples we have heard, they experience that. But I like this, reframing into collective stewardship. So yeah. I would like to ask you, before we open to our very eager audience, do you have any reaction or question for each other in terms of the parallels, the difference? You've already touched on that. Anything else you want to share with each other before we open? Yeah.
I think when it comes to cyber, there's an interesting evolution that we've seen in the space world, because in the past, when space was only the domain of governance and military, they expected to be attacked, so things were inherently more secure. But now space has become so democratized, the barriers to entry are far lower. We see companies using off-the-shelf components and open source software and hardware, so anybody can go and look for the vulnerabilities. So there's a price to democratizing all of these things as well.
Can I respond quickly to that? Yes. I don't know why today I'm so optimistic, but what I wanted to tell you, which is not always the case on cybersecurity, but I think, you nailed a super important point about the democratization, which I also think that represents an opportunity for the multi-stakeholder dimension that we've seen in cyberspace. So as well as there's no, universal treaty and so on and so forth. But what I think is very interesting, because exactly what you were mentioning in terms of like, okay, historically, let's say, managed as a national security issue, and mostly, because of the nature of the infrastructure, mostly, let's say, led by state or private sector companies. I think thanks to several processes, I'm thinking the Internet Governance Forums, I'm thinking like the WISEs, that were kind of like conceived and born in the UN, but immediately understood as it has such an impact on society that we need society to participate. And with the society and the multi-stakeholder approach, I'm thinking about academia, I'm thinking about the civil society organization, and I'm seeing this also, interestingly, when it comes to space and the interaction within the cyber, as well as the subsea cables and so on and so forth. So it's true that there is, let's say, still this sort of like challenge when it comes to, let's say, the actual infrastructure building and governance and owning. But there is also an opportunity for having diverse voices much more involved in the governance. Then what I always advocate for is meaningful participation and meaningful multi-stakeholder approach. Is not always the case, meaning that often is a tick-in-the-box exercise. But there are also some very interesting, let's say, development in this field.
Thank you, Francesca. Yes.
I would say that looking from Antarctica towards the global commons, I think one of the, it's important to remember that the Antarctic Treaty entered into force in 1961, so that's before the UN Law of the Sea in 72. And the global commons have led to a legal principle, which is the common heritage of mankind. So the global commons have the idea of the global commons is translated into a specific legal principle, which would allow the international community to exploit the common, but not only for those countries that have the technology to do so. The common heritage of mankind principle envisages a benefit-sharing mechanism for countries that are not able, that do not have the technological prowess to exploit the global common. So it foresees that the countries that do must share the benefits of their exploitation with the countries that don't. That problem or that issue looms over Antarctica. The Antarctic Treaty was concluded before the concept of the common heritage of mankind came into being, before the legal concept came into being. But clearly, it's a big overarching question that hangs over the Antarctic continent. Will there be, if Antarctica were to be exploited one day, will there be a common heritage of mankind principle applied to Antarctica? Is it those that got there first who have a right to exploit Antarctica, or do they have to share the benefits with the rest of the world and with other countries? And that is unfortunately embodied in the debate on mining in Antarctica. But of course, we have to remember that there are many other ways to exploit Antarctica. Mining is one of them, but there are many other issues in Antarctica. There are many other activities that can take place in Antarctica. Tourism is one of them, is an economic activity. Fishing is another economic activity. Bioprospecting is a third economic activity. And with Antarctica being a continent that's double the size of Australia and that is rapidly warming, living space, using Antarctica to live, is yet another question facing Antarctica. So I would say that the connection between Antarctica and a lot of what we've heard here is the issue of the common heritage of mankind and what principle will apply if Antarctica were to be exploited someday.
Thank you. We have a quick reaction from Aarti, and then we'll end with Sabine, and then we'll take your questions.
Thank you. I think this question about those who can't have access would like the others to share the benefits. This is a recent conversation which has also come up in the space domain. And, you know, I was thinking about this morning. I thought it didn't work with the Moon Treaty. You have the evidence that going down that path is never going to be accepted. So why are you doing it? But at the same time, it's completely understandable, especially when we look at mega constellations and the risk that, you know, a handful of companies may dominate or even monopolize orbits and spectrum, leaving no room for others to participate. So this is an extremely difficult question, but certainly a valid one that's coming up. Thanks.
Thank you. Sabine.
Yeah, I think there are many commonalities there, because also when we look, for example, at the International Seabed Authority that govern the seabeds, have to control and regulate deep seabed mining, and ensure the effective protection of the environment, we exactly have this. Also this basically, so at the moment what you see, there are a few players, and they all come basically from countries that have money, because, for example, it is expensive to do science in the deep sea. So although in theory we have this global commons, we see that actually reality is different. And I think here it's very important to really make it happen, that it becomes really a true global common. And I think here the BBNG treaty provides a good opportunity, as also if one of the main pillars is to capacity building and knowledge transfer. And also, when we just look, for example, at the map of our global ocean, what we know about the deep sea in the global south, there are much less data points than in the north. And of course, the global south ocean is not less important than the global north. So I think it's just really important to embrace that, we go towards a true global commons here.
Wow. Can I just mention a super quick one, which is kind of like, let's say, comforting, even though we're talking about, let's say, pretty severe challenges, to see that despite the cyberspace and not necessarily being recognized in this moment as a global common, we are facing similar issues, so we can also learn, most probably, from the processes. Because when I was thinking about, in a way, the missing voices and regarding the benefit, but also the challenges to access resources, I mean, what I can see in cyberspace is that starting from the digital divide, but then also to the missing voices in the multi-stakeholder consultation that I was mentioning before as an opportunity, most of the developing nations and like global South communities, civil society organization, I very much like also what Sabine was mentioning, because they lack the expertise, but also the resources, basically, and the platforms to participate effectively. I'm thinking about indigenous communities. I'm thinking, let's say, young generations are rarely represented, and there is a sort of like this asymmetry and imbalance. Is for several reasons. I mentioned expertise, resources, and platform, but also the right investment in capacity, in capacity building. Basically, there is let's say one big responsibility, which is the awareness raising, but then also the aspect of empowering, basically, them to actively participate also in the governance debate.
Great, thank you. So we are out of time, but I'll take a couple of questions. Please stand up and you'll get a microphone. I think there's one here and one here in the front. So we'll take these two questions. If you can stand up.
Okay, I think that's new for me. I'm Imar, I work for the Estonian Foreign Service, and so there's two things that came up, which I think are kind of interrelated. When it comes to cyberspace, obviously we've been on the frontiers of those development in Estonia for the past 18 years now. And simultaneously, what we've been seeing over the past years since 2022 is that specifically Russia is abusing the weak points of the global commons, for example, in the way that they've used their shadow fleet, not only to export Russian gas and oil, but also to damage cables running between underneath the Baltic Sea floor. And so these two areas, which I think are kind of interrelated, there are weak spots here. Maritime law currently does not allow us to intervene in any way. So how do we mitigate the worst effects of bad faith actors?
Can I quickly? I mean, and I know we're at time, so I will just share a couple of things. I think there's one bit, and so I still believe, let's say, despite uneven results, as you know, I mean, there are some high-level global policy processes going on, for example, at the UN level, so the open-ended working group and so on and so forth. I mean, again, including the multi-stakeholder component. I do believe there's a space there to continue this conversation, to address and so there's a one bit. I think there's another layer, which is the reality check, which is exactly what you mentioned. And for doing this and for advancing this, there is one key component, which is accountability. And unfortunately, I mean, despite the fact that we can elaborate, let's say, the best treaty possible, it's interesting because, I mean, coming with the UN head, and having spent many years there, my instinct is like, okay, our future cyber treaty should look like, what should be integrated into that, and so on and so forth. But besides that, what I think is key is also ensuring that there are oversight mechanisms, and that you are also able to show the accountability in, let's say, in a very, I would say, limited form, because accountability in cyberspace is also very much linked, and I'm not going into attribution on purpose. Let's stay at the accountability level. Is very much depending also on the resources that you have, the data that you have access to. And I just give you a practical example on our, let's say, small realm. We've been publishing, and they are publicly available, several platforms on cyber attacks against healthcare, cyber attacks against civilian infrastructure in the context of the Ukraine conflict, and at the beginning of this year, cyber attacks against the civil society organization working in the humanitarian space, and so on and so forth. Why? Because we want to expose basically what is happening to them and who are the actors behind that. Then again, the attribution is a very political process, but to your point, I think there is one level which is continuing the, let's say, the governance discussion in the right fora, which I still believe the UN is, and the different, let's say, regional attempts, but then also having the reality check when it comes to join forces for the accountability piece.
Thank you, Francesca.
Just, I think one aspect that is, I think, very important to consider when it comes to ocean use, no matter if it's cables or others, it's effective control in the ocean. The problem with the ocean is that we cannot use satellites to see the seafloor. Actually, we don't even know the exact topography of the ocean floor. With pictures, we have seen probably the size of Belgium, considering the entire ocean, so a very small part. So I think what is really important, if humanity wants to use in the future the ocean, it has also to come with control. And at the moment, we cannot control it. We cannot control if the cables are cut or not. Simply technological-wise, this is not possible. And this is not only true for cables, but this is true basically for whatever we do in the deep ocean. And I think that's a critical thing that, we should all consider.
We'll take one last question here in the front.
Hello, thank you guys for this amazing panel. I'm May. I am a high school student at the International School of Lausanne. So I was curious, as the population of the Earth continues to increase and we continue to have more resource scarcity on our individual nations, and so as countries go more towards the global commons in search for resources, how are these different treaties planning on adapting in order to prevent conflict as countries fight which resource belongs to them? Because historically, most conflicts were caused because of this need and fight for resources.
Thank you very much. Excellent question to end, so I'll give you 30 seconds each to answer. Start here. Sabine.
It's a question of if we are really in need of the resources and at what time scales. I think it's much often about profits and what we think what we need and not what we really need. So, of course, we need certain things and they're distributed around the globe in different countries, in the ocean. But I think we should be really aware of what we use now and also what how technology will change our resource use in the next few years already. So I think this would be my answer to this question. Thank you.
If I
sorry. I think you've asked an excellent question. Can the Antarctic Treaty prevent conflict? I think there's an open question as to whether it is the treaty that has prevented conflict in Antarctica or the ice cover of the continent. I think that remains an open question, frankly. In fact, I would argue that the treaty is setting the ground for conflict because under the guise of science, countries are positioning themselves to grab different portions of Antarctica, different resources of Antarctica. So I think the current Antarctic Treaty regime may actually be setting up the ground for conflict, in my opinion. But it's a debatable issue. However, I think in answer to your question, we absolutely need to have a very frank conversation on the future of Antarctica. The question of Antarctica was on the agenda of the United Nations. It got removed when the key countries that were screaming about the monopolization of Antarctica were let in the system through a back door. But the question is still there. And it's, you know, and clearly countries will want to use Antarctica and sooner rather than later, and we need to have a frank discussion about what the principles need to be for that going forward so that we don't descend into chaos. Thank you.
I'm really happy to come in right after Doaa, what you were saying, because I talked about how the treaties, the space treaties are coming to life now in a way that they were never called on to before. And that shows the anticipatory nature of the diplomacy that's happened in COPUOS. But it's continuing. So mining the moon hasn't yet started. Mining asteroids hasn't yet started. But COPUOS has already started and are already negotiating a first set of draft principles on how to manage what are the legal aspects of space resource activities. So the kind of principles that you're calling for in the space field, I mean, space is hard. It's literally rocket science, right? And more. So thankfully, we have a small window with which we can have the diplomats and try to anticipate, and they're doing so.
Thank you.
Again, slightly different approach, because clearly, I mean, it's difficult to call necessarily, let's say, cyberspace and relate to the resources. There are two parts of my very quick answer, and I'm super happy to elaborate further. One is what I was mentioning before in terms of to diminish or let's say to restrain conflict, we need to have more people involved. Okay, so that's why I go back to the aspect of equity, fairness, let's say global participation, global meaningful participation, hence also enhancing and investing in digital skills and literacy. But then there is another dimension that it's very interesting in what you were saying about the, let's say, the conflict aspect. And so it might be common also to some of the other commons, is because of the nature, let's say, of how cyberspace was built, so nation and private, many of the things that are happening, especially when it comes to conflict, are, let's say, military level, in a way, protected and secured. Hence, we have also a sort of asymmetry of information that we can have access to. But then at the same time, what we've seen recently, notably with the conflict in Ukraine, but I mean, it has been a sort of trend ongoing, is the civilianization of the conflict that we see in cyberspace. And so there's a sort of blurring line between civilian and military domains, and there's a sort of it's interesting that you frame in terms of consuming the resources, because my instinct was well, we need to protect the global digital commons from being consumed by geopolitical rivalry. So I think there's an interesting interplay that we are observing in this moment between a space that it was not human in a way, into being much more humanized, especially from the conflict point of view. And this is also, and I agree also with the previous speakers in terms of this is where anticipatory science and diplomacy should have a role. So kudos.
With that call to action, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. We could go for another 2 hours, 3 hours. I'm sure the speakers will be available to discuss further with each of you this afternoon and tomorrow. I think the takeaway is that we need more cross-pollination between all these different domains and conversations. Hopefully, this is a catalyst for that. Thank you so much. Please give us a little bit of a review if you like this topic so we can continue to put it in the agenda. Thank you all so much. Thank you, speakers.